We'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast was produced, the Gadigal People of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present.
It's January 2014 and we're inside a US Navy FA-18, plummeting towards the Atlantic Ocean. A dogfight has gone terribly wrong, and now Lieutenant Kegan Gill can do nothing but hold on tight as his jet succumbs to an out-of-control dive. He's forced to eject at the unbelievable speed of 695 miles per hour. He crashes into the shark-infested icy waters. His injuries are so severe, he should be dead instantly. Kegan's limbs are torn, and he's suffered a traumatic brain injury. It's a long battle with hypothermia as rescue teams race to find him. When he regains consciousness in hospital, he realises his injuries are catastrophic. His life will never be the same. I'm at Middleton, and this is Headgame. Today, Kegan Gill on his epic journey to hell and back. Mate, look, you look like you're in One Piece, so that's good news, mate. That's good news. And having read your story, how you're still in one piece is absolutely amazing, and you've almost fought through an impossible scenario to be where you are today. But let's go back to the beginning, mate.
Sure.
You know, you're a retired, because of the incident, US Navy fighter pilot. Was the military always in your family or always in your bones? And how did you come to joining the military at such a young age?
You know, it really wasn't in my family very deeply. I had an uncle who was a Marine, and my grandfather served in World War II, but my immediate family was actually sort of a group of hippies. You know, they wouldn't let me have G.I. Joes when I was a kid. I couldn't play violent video games. I was allowed to have guns, so I could go out and go hunting. So I was always out in the woods, camping, hunting, fishing, just being a kid, climbing trees, doing all the stuff that little boys should be doing, building forts, you know, catching salmon with my hands in the river behind our house, and just having a good time. But I definitely wasn't built to be stuck in a cubicle, sitting at an office job under fluorescent lighting all day. And I had a really good professor in college who was a former Navy test pilot. He had flown with the Sea Wolves back in the Vietnam War. So he had been in the heat of some of the most intense conflict, flying Huey gunships and all sorts of stuff after. And so he sort of rubbed off on me a little bit, but I ended up becoming a flight instructor while I was in college. I ended up becoming a corporate pilot for about a year after I graduated from college. And I had a friend who was applying to go to Navy OCS, Officer Candidate School, to become an officer in the military and try to become a pilot. And at the time, I didn't realize that you could even do that. I was a community college kid. You know, I thought you had to go to the Naval Academy and your dad had to be an admiral. I didn't realize just a guy off the street with a bachelor's degree could apply and potentially make it to fly F-18s.
So basically, you went down the commercial route. And then a buddy of yours said, "Hey, listen, this is what I'm doing," and that sparked something within your mind or within your heart where you thought, you know what, I'm gonna see if I can not transfer over, but start this program.
Yeah, exactly right. And until that moment, it kind of dawned on me, like, well, maybe I can do that. And there's this website called airwarriors.com that gave me a guide on like how to prepare, what I needed to know, how to get the application going, and everything. And so I just kind of dug into it and realized this was a viable option for me. And I was getting a little, while the corporate job was great, it paid really well, it was really cushy, got to go out to really nice dinners all the time and travel the world. It was a good gig. But
Who wants that, Kegan?
I got bored of it, I was like, I need something more than this. It became very routine. And I had that calling to adventure, which led me to apply, and I ended up getting in. And so I headed to Navy OCS, spent a few months getting my ass kicked by Marine Corps drill instructors, and graduated as a Navy Ensign 01 officer that basically doesn't know what in the world they're doing, and headed to flight training.
And what was it like? What was it like that transition? Because you, like you said, you're flying around the world. You got a cushy job. You're eating good food. You're being super respected, and all of a sudden you're being yelled at and screamed at by the drill sergeant. You're like, was it quite a shock for you, or were you completely expecting it?
I mean, that's what I signed up for. I wanted it. I wanted that experience. I'd seen Full Metal Jacket and all these movies that guys get, and I was like, I knew what I was getting into, and I prepared for it. I hit the gym really hard. I was in really good shape. I prepared myself, memorized everything I possibly could in advance, and I showed up ready to get my ass kicked. And I really liked it because I don't know, when there's other people around you that are freaking out at the scenario, yet you're like dead calm. It's somehow there's this weird place that I could get into with that, where I was just at peace in that environment. And I really liked it and thrived at it and made my way through flight school.
I reacted well to that when someone was on my ass and they were yelling and screaming at me. I was thinking, right, just get it done, right the first time. And they stopped yelling, they stopped being on my ass. And it worked really, 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 really well for me. So you've done that, and then you say you went to flight school. So is there sort of two stages to this?
Yeah, so the OCS portion, the Officer Candidate School, that's just kind of like boot camp for the officer side of things. As long as you have a 4-year degree, you can go in and do that program. But once you come out of that, you still got to earn your wings if you're going to be a pilot. And the whole way through that is incredibly competitive. You're competing with all the other guys for the slots, for the jets and the more desirable aircraft. But yeah, you do a little water survival training, some ground school. Everything's graded, everything, people are kind of dropping like flies the whole way through. OCS, a bunch of people drop out. API, the ground school, people drop out. Water survival, people freak out when they have to wear their boots and flight suit and go swim a mile in the pool, or get flipped upside down in the helo dunker for the survival training. People freaked out, but I was like, I loved that. That was like what I signed up for, I winged as a naval aviator in May of 2012. And then I headed for the most challenging training yet, which was the training in the F-18 Super Hornet. And, walking into that hangar and seeing these jets and how big they are in person, it was surreal. Like, I can't believe this is going to be my job.
And you said there, what was it like getting your wings, passing that training? Because just getting on selection is a big, big feat, like you said. But then you start to see all these sort of experienced, elite soldiers drop. And it motivates you just to keep going. You look around, you go, God, there's only a few of us left out of this big batch of individuals, and then you get badged, or you get your wings. For me, it was one of the proudest moments of my life. Take me back to the moment, because I can imagine that imposter syndrome from becoming a commercial pilot to now receiving your wings. How did it feel?
Yeah, I mean, it was incredible. It was like a serious, deep pride that I experienced. I'm sure similar to yourself. When you put that little thing on your chest that says you've done it, and it's like, holy shit, I can't believe I did it, and I'm so proud. And then very quickly you show up at the F-18 training. You're like, I'm a winged aviator. I know what I know. And then you realize you don't know anything. And you go right back down to the bottom of the food chain.
Yeah, do you know what? That was. I made sure that I relished in the moment for all of a couple of hours, and they're like, you pass selection, and they give you your beret and belt, and they say it's harder to keep than to earn, and then they kick you back into a squadron, and they're like, oi, get the brews on, get the tea and coffees on.
Right. You're back to making coffee. Yep.
Brilliant. I was quite lucky because I deployed straight to Afghanistan, so I was quite lucky. Within 2 weeks, I was out with the boys. So I managed to sort of miss that part. But walking through that hangar, and what you just mentioned, what was it like walking through that hangar, knowing that you were going to jump into one of these beasts?
It was absolutely surreal. It was a mixture of excitement and nerves of like, okay, you can't screw this up. You made it this far. So there's just so much pressure on you while you get those little moments of just bliss and surreal. A lot of the time you're just so busy and so stressed out about all the things you got to know. It very quickly, it can kind of diminish that excitement that you showed up. It's like you show up, I'm ready to do this thing, but now I actually got to do it.
And how long until you were sort of left to your own devices to fly one of these FA-18 fighter jets?
It's pretty quick before you start soloing the jet. I think there's a very robust ground training. So you're doing lectures, computer-based training, as well as simulator training. So you learn the procedures of the aircraft, you learn the emergency procedures, and then you're only in the aircraft for about, I think it was maybe 4 flights that you have an instructor in the back with a stick. And after that, you're solo. So you really only have a few hours in the F-18 in real life before you're sent out the door on your first solo.
You guys train pretty much like us, like as if it's real time, don't you? So you are going into these dogfights as if you are, serving and protecting your country.
Yeah, I mean, you hear the term routine training mission or training mission, and I think people in the civilian world hear that and they're like, oh, they're just training, like they're just dicking around out there. But like you guys, our training is as close to the real thing as possible, and oftentimes we're training in skill sets that are very infrequently used in real combat. But you're still fighting the jet, especially with dogfighting, CAS, all these things. You're close proximity to the ground. You're maneuvering these aircraft at the edge of the capability. You're multitasking, managing all these systems, talking on multiple radios. Like, there's a lot going on, and it's really difficult, and it's extremely dangerous. And with dogfighting, you are doing everything that you would do in a real dogfight with just a couple training rules put in place to keep you a little bit safer than you would maybe be in a real scenario. But other than, not hosing off real missiles or ordnance at like guns at one another, we're doing it dang near as close as you can get to the real thing.
Just explain to me what a dogfight looks like.
Yeah, so a dogfight is 2 or more aircraft within visual range of one another, basically trying to shoot each other down. It's sort of the epitome of what people probably think when they think fighter pilot. So you're trying to hit the other guy with a missile or gunfire to shoot them out of the air. And so in order to do that, you oftentimes got to get their jet in front of you and get behind them ideally so that you can get a missile or gunfire that's going to actually hit them with a real shot. So as a pilot, you're maneuvering the jet, you're pulling 7.5 Gs, you're performing this thing at the edge of its capabilities. So if you can imagine, your body here with your gear on weighs 200, 220 pounds. Now you're under all that G-force at 7.5 Gs. Now it's like you weigh 15 or 1,600 pounds that you can feel. And you can imagine that crushing weight. So it's sort of like doing a high-intensity interval training. You're playing 4-dimensional chess. You're operating weapon systems, radar, defensive systems. You're talking on multiple radios. Like, there's just a ton going on. And it's not uncommon, especially when you're a younger guy, to have what they call a helmet fire, where your brain is just so overwhelmed with information that it's just like you don't know what to do. So it's incredibly intense, and it's probably the most demanding thing that we do as far as the physical demand and the mental demand combined together is that dogfight.
Yeah, talk to me about the physical demand, because you mentioned the G-force there. You're not only fighting the enemy where you have to be psychologically switched on and in the game, but you're fighting the aircraft. Like you said, you're bending this aircraft. You're fighting the Gs. You have to be trained enough to ignore that so you can stay psychologically switched on 100% on the target. Otherwise, you're not going to make it out, right? And what's it like physically to be in that situation under those Gs whilst having to perform at such a high level?
Yeah, it's you can imagine you're squeezing your legs, you're squeezing your glutes, you're squeezing your core to try to force that blood up into your head. You're doing what's called the anti-G straining maneuver, which is where you're breathing and then you're kind of locking up your throat and kind of forcing the blood into your head. And so you're taking these really shallow little breaths to try to force that blood up in your head. You're doing everything you can just so you don't pass out. So imagine just doing like a max deadlift and you're pushing at the extremes of your deadlift and your vision's getting, narrow. And while you're doing that, you're having to think, you're having to fly the jet, you're having to operate the weapon systems, you're having to talk on all these radios. It's kind of the edge of what I think the human mind and body are capable of doing.
Let's go back to the 15th of Jan, 2014. And now I can see you nodding your head there. That's a day that changed everything. Could you just take me back, if you can, Kegan, to that morning when you woke up? And I don't want to say just a normal routine, because when people say, "Oh, just this," practicing in such a high stressed situation, and dogfights in training scenarios, it's not just a normal routine. Everyone is so different. Everyone requires, it depends how you wake up, depends how you feel in the morning. How did you feel on the morning of the 15th of Jan 2014 going into work?
Yeah, got up and it kind of felt like a routine day at this point. I had been in my first fleet squadron. I'd been through years of all this flight training to earn my wings, to get through the F-18 training pipeline. And now I'd been in my first fleet squadron for nearly a year. And so it was starting to feel like a normal job, Yeah, I was going to go fly an $89 million fighter jet, but it was starting to become a bit routine. And despite as crazy as what I was about to go do that day, I woke up in the morning just like I was heading into the office, and it's also, you don't realize that any day could be life altering if things don't go right. And so, I got ready just like anybody else does. I took a shower, got dressed, headed into work, drove in, showed up at the office, the squadron in the ready room, and was ready to go fly, but just had no idea what was about to come down the line.
So when you go in and you go and fly, you're going in, you're going to be doing a dogfight training scenario. Were you feeling particularly nervous or excited that day, or was it, like you said, was it just a case of, right, let's see what we're going to do, let's get out there and let's get this scenario done?
Yeah, I was feeling good that day. Like I felt like I was doing well in my squadron. I was still a fairly new pilot in the squadron, but I was well respected. I was working hard. That same mentality that I had in flight school, where I would work my butt off. I might not be the smartest dude, but I'm going to outwork everybody if I can. And so I showed up prepared for my flight. We brief everything extremely meticulously, everything from the admin of just getting to and from the airspace we're going to utilize that day. We're looking at all the different factors, from the weather, the water temperature, the air temperatures, the cloud conditions, and we brief everything in great detail. And then we get into the tactical side of things. And what are we going to do today? How are we going to fight these jets? What kind of setups are we going to do for the dogfighting? And so you brief all of that ahead of time. And that morning I showed up at the squadron, and my buddy Fisty was at the duty desk, which all the pilots rotate through, just answering the phones and coordinating the flight schedule. And as a joke, he had put up on the whiteboard the airspace that we were going to utilize that day, which is normal. But then he put all these little positions of GPS tagged sharks that were out in the airspace. He used the shark tracker app on his phone to look up all these sharks positions and put them up there. And he said, "Hey, today would be a terrible day to eject. The water temperature is at 37 degrees Fahrenheit, so near freezing water temperatures. The air temperature is below freezing. We've got wind and churned up ocean swell. And there's a great white shark named Mary Louie. The 16-foot, 3,500-pound white shark was directly underneath the airspace." So we're laughing about this. And then an hour later, I'm out over that airspace. And that's the moment that really my life took a drastic change.
Wow. Take me back to the moment and, or seconds before the moment that you realized that you were going to have to eject, that that you were going to end up in these icy, shark-infested waters. And why did you have to eject?
Yeah, so we had done several rounds of fighting for the day. We did a little air-to-air refueling before we started the dogfighting, and then the flight lead and I broke off to our own airspace and did several rounds of this fighting. So you can imagine it like a round in martial arts, where you fight until there's a clear winner or loser, and then you set back up. And you just kind of do that over and over again. And we had hit Joker fuel, so we had just enough fuel left to get one short fight out. So we ended up setting up quite a bit lower and quite a bit faster than typical for a 1 mile of beam set, which is what it was caused. So the aircraft were side by side about a mile apart from one another. And the flight lead called fights on. We pitched our jets in. As I came to that merge where our flight paths crossed, I was already about 30 degrees nose low and partially inverted. So I opted to continue to roll my jet inverted and pull down in a split S maneuver to dive the aircraft down towards the ocean. And normally that aircraft can do it in about 5,000 feet of vertical airspace. But I didn't realize how fast my airspeed had gotten because of the unusual setup of the fight. And so as I hit about bullseye nose low in this jet, all of a sudden a system on the aircraft kicked in that thought that there were bombs on the wings that weren't actually there. And it limited the G-force that I could pull. So I went from the 7.5 G pull where I can feel just my head and helmet at ground would weigh about 20 pounds with the Jehemix helmet, which is sort of this big bulky super space helmet that we wear, where all of our weapons displays and everything can go with you wherever you look. So say that my head and my helmet weigh about 20 pounds on the ground. Now at nearly 8 Gs, that's like having 150 pounds just on my head. You can feel that. You're looking around because you got to keep sight of the other guy. And then all of a sudden that just eased. As I'm looking up trying to spot my flight lead so I can try to shoot him, I just feel the jet settle. So it was like going around a sharp corner in a sports car and then having the steering wheel kick back halfway. Only instead of skidding off the road, I'm stuck in a dive at the ocean. And this all just happens in a few seconds. Before I know it, my radar altimeter is going off, going altitude, altitude, meaning I just broke through the 5,000 foot hard deck that we put there for training purposes as the ground when we're training. So now, at least in this training environment, I'm dead because I just went through the ground.
You have a hard deck and a ceiling, don't you? Is that correct?
Sometimes you'll have a ceiling, but oftentimes where we were training that day, we didn't have a restriction on the ceiling.
So you're going through this hard deck that you're not meant to penetrate.
Yeah, so I went through that hard deck, which, my heart sank at this point. The aircraft is not responding to my control inputs. I'm now in an out-of-control aircraft. The ocean is rushing up at me. In my display, in my helmet and the HUD, there's an arrow, and it's saying, pull up, pull up. And I'm thinking, I'm pulling up. The stick is in my lap, and the jet is not turning as it's being commanded. And the ocean just rushed up at me and filled the canopy. And you get that feeling where your heart just sinks, like something terrible is about to happen. And that's the emotion that just kind of froze. And from there, my body just took over instinctually. I assumed the ejection position. I grabbed the cable between my legs and pulled. And freaking within a half second, that rocket motor ignited under the seat, blasting me. Initially, you get a 50 G instantaneous blast, which you can imagine your body weighing 50 times its normal weight. That compresses your spine, knocks the wind out of your lungs. That eased to a 12 to 14 G sustained rocket boost. A normal ejection is very violent, even if you're straight and level flight below 180 knots, which is ideal. I was well outside of that envelope. I was 2 seconds from impact going 695 miles per hour. So basically at the speed of sound. And what messed me up so bad was impacting the sound barrier with my body. And it turns out the human body is not terribly aerodynamic at the speed of sound. And it just wrecked me. I mean, ripped my helmet off my head, traumatic brain injury, bashed my face up. Like I looked like I got my ass kicked in 15 rounds with Mike Tyson. Broke my C1 in my neck. My left shoulder, the scapula shattered. Both my arms just ragdolled, shattering my humerus and my upper arms. My right humerus tore through my right brachial artery, causing rapid internal bleeding. My left forearm shattered the radius and ulna and severed the median nerve that controls my left hand. I had a brachial plexus injury from my spinal compression. That's the nerve group that controls a lot of the upper body. The gear on my vest was all ripping off. My radio, my signaling equipment, all of it gone. My dry suit that I was wearing to protect me from that icy cold ocean water below ripped apart and shredded open. My boots were flailing around so violently they became like wrecking balls, smashing open my lower leg. So I had 2 open tib fractures, chunks of my bone falling out of my dry suit, falling into the water to chum it up for Mary Lee down below. And this all just happens in a split second,
Wow.
By the time the ejection sequence had completed, I was a second and a half from impacting the ocean. In that time, the jet impacted the ocean and just vaporized into nothing. And miraculously, that parachute deployed that slowed me enough so I didn't die at impact with the water. But very quickly, that parachute that had just saved my life then sunk underneath that churning ocean swell and started to pull me under. The dry suit that was supposed to protect me from this icy cold, like needle-like freaking water going in my face and neck and filling up the dry suit turned into this big old sea anchor. And so now, with broken arms and legs, I was just at the mercy of that parachute. The seawers, which are the explosive devices that detect salt water and automatically disconnect the parachute from you, both of those devices failed. So I remained trapped to the parachute, which then, for anybody who's ever been held underwater when you need a breath of air, it was just that over and over and over. And I was getting held under the point where I needed a breath of air and I couldn't get it. And at a certain point, your lungs just start to spasm and you start to slurp in that salt water. And I don't know how I eventually would get pulled back to the surface. Luckily, my LPU, the life preserver unit around my neck, had inflated, and that created enough buoyancy that on occasion I would rise to the surface, cough up some water, get a quick breath of air, yell for help, and then pulled back underneath. In the meantime, my flight lead spotted my parachute opening and knew that there was an emergency. He rapidly coordinated the on-scene commander. He got a hold of air traffic control, and he spotted a fishing vessel about a mile from my position. And he was able to get down really low and really fast when they wouldn't answer on the radio and blasted over their bow and thumped them. So like a show of force over these fishermen that are out there just chilling. And he got their attention. He was able to get them over to my GPS position that he had dropped. And when they got there, they tried to throw a rope out to me to get me to pull in. And I wasn't able to grab it. It just ended up getting tangled in the paracord. But at least that fishing vessel provided a rough location from where I was at, because I was in the drifting ocean with those currents. Otherwise, I would have drifted out and wouldn't be here to tell you this story. Eventually, a couple Navy H-60 Seahawk helicopters arrived on scene. And on that 40-ish minute flight, I was in and out of consciousness. I was coding. They were doing everything they could to resuscitate me and keep me alive. And they said I would go from like stillness of death to just shouting and screaming. And I don't have memory of it because I was in such bad shock and in such a bad brain injury. But, it was a wild ride for that crew. And they eventually got me to the hospital. They rushed me in. They took my core body temperature. I was at 87 degrees Fahrenheit. So I should have been dead from the hypothermia. But the hypothermia had actually constricted the blood flow and preserved my brain function well enough to keep me alive. They had to do multiple blood transfusions for all the blood loss. They had to treat me for rhabdo because my kidneys were so overwhelmed with all this tissue breakdown. And once I was semi-stable and the water was pumped out of my lungs, they induced a coma and then rushed me into surgery. I spent the next week undergoing over a dozen different trauma surgeries as they reconstructed my skeleton from titanium rods, steel plates, screws. They sutured me back up from all the fasciotomies that they performed to salvage my limbs from amputation. I was covered in hundreds of staples and sutures. I had a brachial artery bypass where they took a vein from inside my arm and did it like a Frankenstein job so that I could get blood to my hands. Anyways, it was a miracle that I was still alive, but I was still in a comatose state. And, all the members of my squadron, my family are at the ICU waiting room waiting to hear, is he even going to live? And someone in the squadron piped up and said, he's a scrappy motherfucker. He'll be all right.
Kegan, one question for you, mate. How are you still alive?
It was seriously miracle after miracle. All these little twists and turns throughout it were unbelievable. I really think there was some kind of divine intervention that I was still meant to be here for something, because I shouldn't have lived. And I'm just lucky to be here.
So at that stage that you eject, your training just kicks in, right? It's not okay. What's that thought process? Is it, I'm going to die here, or is it just going to, or you, right, I need to kick into my training and I need to eject ASAP?
Yeah, it was as that oh shit feeling hit me and the ocean was rushing up, it was just instinctual. And that training kicked in. Like, we had practiced getting into that position and all the time, and like all that just kicked in. And from there, from the moment that I felt that oh shit feeling and I looked down and saw the ocean, from there I have no linear memory. Like, my mind just went, we got it from here, buddy. Hold on for the ride. And just my survival instincts and training kicked in. And I have little flashbacks from being in the ocean, but most of what I'm telling you has been recreated through the investigation process, the retrieval of the black box. So I was really in and out of consciousness in the water.
Is there any memory whatsoever? Do you have any flashbacks? Is there any sort of memory reconstruction that you're doing, or was it just one blur until you find yourself in the hospital?
Yeah, so for years I dealt with night terrors where I would go back into the water and I'd be feeling the emotions, I would be feeling the darkness, I would be feeling the terror, the combination of one, I'm being drowned alive, I can't breathe, I'm being pulled underneath the water and I can't swim. And there's a shark that's going to frickin' finish me off. So I got those moments of just the emotional terror of being in the water. But other than those little clips, I don't have really anything from the time I reached to pull that ejection handle until about 2 weeks later, and the lights finally started to come back on.
Wow. And you mentioned all your injuries. What was your thought process? What was going through your head when you obviously realized that you could never, fly again and never, go back to doing something that you trained so hard for, that you spent your whole life thriving towards?
Yeah, I woke up and it was like waking up from a dream, except for some reason my bedroom wasn't my bedroom and there were all these people there smiling and talking to me. And I was hooked up to all these machines and I was covered in staples and sutures and wound vac, and my arms and legs were all vacuum sealed. And one of my first thoughts was they had tied me down the bed. Like, why am I tied onto the bed? Why is this blanket holding me down? But it was because I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. And eventually the medical staff came in and they kind of explained the scenario and said, you've been in an ejection. You're lucky to be alive, but you're likely never going to walk again. You're never going to be able to use your arms or hands again, and your military flying career is over. And in that moment, there was a spark in me. It was, I think, the same spark that got me to be a fighter pilot in the first place, which was, go ahead and tell me I can't do something. I'm going to fucking prove you wrong. And I spent the next 2 years undergoing all sorts of intense rehabilitation. I spent 3 months in the Poly Trauma Center just doing speech therapy, vision therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, kinesiotherapy, you name it. I was doing it, working my ass off. It may have meant I just wiggled something that day, but every day I was doing everything I could. And I had this opportunity in there, in that darkness. I could have just bit off on all the darkness, all the dread, all the statistics, all the, hey, you're not going to get better. But instead, I had this little spark of fire in me still. And that's what I started to feed. What if I do get better? What's it going to be like when I come back into this hospital in my flight suit with my wings on my chest upright and say, hey, I'm back flying jets? And so that's what I started to cultivate. Instead of biting off on all the dark shit, which there were some hard days, no doubt, but what I really started to feed and work consistently towards with discipline was, what do I need to do today to get better? Even if it's just a tiny bit better. And every day wasn't always progress either, but I was always working at that light, working towards that little spark of hope. And little by little, I eventually got out of the Poly Trauma Center. I started to be able to get around on a walker. I started to be able to wipe my own ass again, brush my own teeth. All these things they said I couldn't do. And after 2 years of more surgeries, undergoing, overcoming prescription drug addiction to all the pain meds they had me on, I was able to gain a stack of medical waivers. I had to go through a field naval aviator evaluation board, so an investigation into the crash, which ruled in my favor and gave me the option, if I could get my body physically back, I could go back and fly. And after 2 years of all of that, I was able to max out the Navy's physical fitness test again. I was literally running circles around the people at the command that I was at while I was recovering. And I returned to the cockpit of the F-18 after all of that.
So you've flown since?
Yeah, I went back to active duty as a Navy F-18 pilot.
You are shitting me.
No. And to tell you the truth, it gets even crazier from here, just so you know. We're just getting into the good stuff now.
Listen, so you 2 years, you've got that spark inside you, and I understand that spark when someone says you can't do something, or someone doubts you, or someone, you're just like, right, listen. So you actually believe in your mind from the moment they tell you you're never going to fly again. You believe in your mind that you're going to get back in a fight in an F-18 fighter jet.
Yeah. It was the same. It was the same little belief that I had that imagined that I could be an F-18 pilot. All the people, who could be an F-18 pilot? And in that same, I didn't know what I was doing at the time, but it was the same process. It was, what's the goal? Can I do it? I'm going to visualize doing it. How do I get there? I start now with consistent work and discipline, and I work towards it little by little. And that was the same thought mindset that I went into this accident was, okay, they're telling me this is impossible. That's what they said about becoming an F-18 pilot. I'm going to apply the same mindset to this. So how do I do it? What's the mindset? And I think the mind is so powerful. You know, I don't think that we even can comprehend the power that it has when you are positively affirming what you can do, and then you work at it with consistent action. I think we can really accomplish damn near anything.
And I love what you said about, being consistently disciplined, because ultimately that's the key. How did you remain, and what is discipline in your eyes?
Discipline is just holding yourself accountable. You know, discipline is those days you wake up and you hurt and you don't want to try, but you do it anyways. That's the discipline. It's nobody else is telling you. Nobody else may even know that you got this going on, but it's holding yourself accountable in doing that.
And almost doing the things that you should be doing, but you don't want to do, right? And you mentioned it, it's the small percentages, the 0.01 percentages, it's tiny progress. People don't realize, people think being disciplined, you're going to go from 0 to 100. That doesn't exist, does it? It's the small steps.
Little steps.
Take me back to that moment, and were people absolutely shocked that you got back into a jet?
Yeah, I mean, the duty station I was at, the job I was doing, the Commodore of the Strike Fighter Wing was my boss at that point. And he saw me at Command PT out there just crushing it. And he was just in disbelief. You could see his mouth is just like, huh? How is this guy back doing this? But because of that, they saw where I had come, and, I was doing well at my ground job too. I was, taking on a lot of responsibility, and I was doing the same stuff at work. I was working hard at what I was doing and doing a good job at it. And they saw I was physically and mentally back. And so I was blessed with the opportunity to return to the cockpit. One day he walks into the office, I'm filling out emails. I've been sitting at this stupid desk for, a year or whatever while I was doing the recovery. And he comes in, he says, "Hey, Gil, what are you doing today?" It's like, "Oh, I'm just working on this." He's like, "You want to go back and fly?" And he's like, "Yeah." Thinking like, "Oh, maybe I'm going to start in a few weeks or a month." He's like, "No, you start right now." and so I basically just headed out that day, and my mind's just crazy. Like, holy shit, this is really happening. It was overwhelming, a combination of excitement and then the nerves hitting me of like, oh, I actually got to do this now. The game's back on, the pressure's back on.
Take me back to you getting in there, because obviously there must have been a wave of emotions, nervousness, anxiety. Was there a moment, and I'm probably getting a bit too dramatic, was there a moment where you're just flying along and it's surreal, you can't believe you're here?
Yeah, I on my first solo back, I definitely had that surreal feeling. And I went out into the airspace and I decided I need to roll this thing inverted and I need to pull it at the ocean and do that maneuver, because I want to see, I got back on the horse, but I need to see, am I going to freak out if I do the same thing? And so I rolled that thing inverted and pulled down at the ocean, and it was just pure joy and excitement. The ocean's rushing up at me. I pull out the bottom as the jet should have done in the first place. And I was just like, yes, I'm back.
So you went and done the exact same maneuver that was supposed to happen on the day of the 15th of Jan, and you went and executed that and came out of it. Yeah,
but at a slower airspeed so that the jet didn't freak out, and it didn't have a code on it that was telling it not to turn. So it was basically doing the same thing, more or less.
And what did that feel like? What did that flight feel like?
Just overwhelming joy, and then I got back to flying, and I made it through the flight training pipeline. I graduated as the top stick. I graduated with the River Rat Award, meaning I was a lot of fun to hang out with outside the cockpit. And I went back to a fleet squadron, and I was back at it. And this is kind of where the happy ending Disney version of my story would be, but this is really where the real mindset and difficulties started to begin as my career progressed. I was on a flight on a detachment down at Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida. We were doing a live fire missile exercise. So I went out and I got to fire a live AIM-9 Mike Sidewinder missile, a heat-seeking missile at a drone, and then broke off and got to do some dogfighting with an F-22 Raptor. So just like the world's most premier freaking dogfighting aircraft, just this thing that I had seen at air shows as a kid and drooled over. and I got to be up there wrapping it up with this
Same.
guy. And so I came back from that flight, and I remembered fighting the Raptor and all of that, but I couldn't remember what was going on in the missile chute. And while I was watching the debrief, watching my tapes, I was getting confused by the symbology and like stuff that I normally know was really hard to understand. And I just thought, maybe I'm just tired. And I tried to sleep it off that night. The next day I felt even worse. And when I got back to my hotel room on that second day, I was in a panic for some reason. I was having panic attacks, which I had never had. I was sat down on the edge of the bed in the hotel room, and it felt like the whole room tumbled around me. I was experiencing vertigo. I was having a really hard concentrating and was confused. And I sat down on the bed to try to set my phone alarm because I had to get up in the morning and fly. And I couldn't do the math, and I couldn't operate a cell phone. So I realized something was wrong. There had been a number of incidents in the F-18 community where the pressurization systems had been malfunctioning, causing rapid decompression of the cockpit. And as divers would know, decompression sickness, if you come up from depth too quickly, the nitrogen can come out of solution in your blood and it can form bubbles. Yeah, you get those in your joints, you get the bends, it's painful, but you get those bubbles in your brain, it can block the blood flow, and it can give you like stroke-like symptoms or aneurysm or even kill you, when you're not getting proper blood circulation to the brain. And so it was suspected because there had been a number of these in the F-18 community to the point that they had started to put hyperbaric treatment facilities on the aircraft carriers to treat guys coming back from flights with this condition. They rushed me to a dive base that was nearby at Mayport and treated me for decompression sickness overnight and the hyperbaric oxygen therapy. The next day, I was still a bit out of it, but a little bit better. And when I got back from that detachment, I kind of reluctantly went into the medical, kind of weighing my options at this point, which is in a high-speed job in the military. As you know, as soon as you start to say there's something not right, like there goes your medical clearance, there goes maybe your security clearance. So it's very taboo. But I knew like whatever was going on, there's no way I could safely operate an aircraft. And so, kind of knowing the weight of the situation, I went in to see the flight surgeon. And pretty quickly, I got a delayed onset PTSD diagnosis, and they all kind of just bit off on that PTSD thing. And it all just became about my emotional state. And let's sit down and talk about this state. And it was not helpful. It was frustrating because in hindsight, what was going on is the hardware of my brain had been messed with pretty hardcore. I had physical damage to my brain from not only the ejection, but now a decompression event that exacerbated, adding insult to injury. And it was just screwing with my head. But the way they made me feel was this was all just an emotional thing that I needed to get over. And I was thinking, I can compartmentalize anything. I've been compartmentalizing my whole career. I can put that in a bottle and move on. But this wasn't working because the hardware was damaged. But instead of fixing the hardware, what they did is they started to give me these pills. They started SSRIs. They started an antipsychotic medication called quetiapine for sleep. It was supposed to help with severe insomnia. The thought was, if we can just get you some sleep, you'll get better, which I think there was merit to that. But when you give somebody a sleeping pill, they're not getting restful sleep. It may knock me out into this unconscious state. So as things progressed, I just got worse and worse. I went into...
But you're not sleeping, are you? You're
not sleeping.
You're just
not
knocked
resting.
out. Mm-hmm.
And I started to go into hypervigilance and paranoia, into full-blown psychoses. I thought the government was hunting me. I thought they were trying to poison me and my family. And it just got worse and worse. I was eventually medically retired, and that treatment continued at the VA once I got out and my family moved back to Michigan. And I was just getting worse and worse. And within a couple days of having my dosage of quetiapine increased from 300 milligrams a night to 450 milligrams a night, my wife came home from a job interview, and that's like a heroic dose of this shit. And, she came home and she heard me rustling around. And when she came into the room, I was completely naked. I had shaved off all my hair in chunks. I had shaved off my eyebrows for some reason. My facial hair was all shaved off. The only thing I had on was I had a black plastic garbage bag tied around my neck like a cape because I thought I was like Batman or Superman, and I was going to go out into the northern Michigan snowy weather and fight crime like that. So she loaded us up. She's a trauma nurse, so she had dealt with psychotic patients before in the ER, but now it's her husband, which was a whole different thing to deal with. But she loaded us up. took me to the emergency room, and I spent a couple nights in an out-of-body experience in the psychoses. And when I came to, I had been transferred to a VA inpatient psych facility. And as I became lucid and more aware in that facility, what I saw was truly abysmal treatment of veterans in that facility. When you're on one-to-one care, every 15 minutes, they would come into the room, shine a flashlight in your face to wake you up and make sure you're being safe. It's hard to sleep in this place to begin with. There's all these other guys having psychotic events. There's yelling and screaming all night. There's people walking in and out of your room. Everything's hard tile floors and concrete walls, so everything just echoes through the place. You're confined into a very small facility. We were lucky if we got to go outside into a concrete yard surrounded by metal fences and brick buildings, maybe once a week if we were lucky. So we were getting no exercise, no sunlight. And the only answer there was more pills and more pills. And
ultimately it was the detox. You had to detox yourself off these pills in order to become sane again, right? It was the pills that was...
Yeah. I eventually got out of that facility. I spent 40 days living in that nightmare of a place, but with the advocacy of my family, they were able to get me out. And then I sought a different route to treatment, and I stumbled across psychedelic-assisted therapy. And I stumbled across this whole world of modalities for treating brain injury and mental health issues that aren't available at the VA. They aren't available through mainstream insurance. And that's what really worked for me and gave me my life back. And, through the use of psychedelic-assisted therapy, traumatic brain injury clinics where they actually went in and addressed the physiology that was off, doing lab work to actually see where the physiology of my body was off, and then addressing that with nutraceutical supplementation, hyperbaric oxygen therapy. There's this whole world of healthcare that can actually heal the brain. And what's amazing about the brain is I remember growing up and they'd always say, you damage your brain or a brain cell and it's gone. You're never going to get it back. Well, that's simply not true. The brain is constructed of cells just like the body is. And when you give it the right conditions, which are sleep, good food, clean hydration, exercise, sunlight, all that stuff, the body heals, the cells heal and regenerate. And it's amazing what the human brain can heal from. Even the level of damage that I had going on has been mitigated through this, several years of this kind of treatment. But pretty much everything that I've had that works is not available at the VA, and it's not available through mainstream medical system. They're actually actively trying to fight this stuff because it's competition with their business model. They don't want something that can fix you. They want to be able to give you a pill the rest of your life and make a profit off of that.
What you've just explained is something that I'm working on for vets as well, which is super interesting that you just hit on that. But let's finish off on the Phoenix Revival. Talk to me a bit about this, about your memoir, where we can get it, and why you wrote it.
Yeah, so I really felt inspired to share my story after having gone through that, seeing so many guys struggling in that system. So, and this is a widespread problem throughout the world right now. I think there's a lot of healthcare systems that are pretty messed up, especially with the mental health treatment. And I remember being in this place of darkness and all of that. Despite my hard charging attitude to get me through the physical recovery of the ejection and got me into the world of the fighter pilot, being an F-18 pilot to begin with, even with all that, I got into a place that was so dark and lonely and broken. I was ready to end it and felt so alone. And so I wanted to be the light for other people that are in that same darkness, the same light that I wish I had. And so that's what inspired me to write this book, Phoenix Revival, the aftermath of Naval Aviation's fastest survived ejection. It goes in much more detail about some of the things we talked about today that I hope will help inspire people and also give them the proper tools so that they can get themselves out of whatever they're going through. Some practical guidance, some resources that can really make a difference in people's lives. So that's why I wrote it. But please check out a copy. I promise you, you're going to have a hard time putting it down.
Do you know what, mate? You are the epitome of physical robustness, psychological resilience, and emotional intelligence. Wrap that all into one. You have Kegan Gill. Kegan, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for coming on board. Make sure you pick up a copy of Phoenix Revival to hear more, because we've just scraped the surface here. Kegan, thank you so much, mate.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was a pleasure.
To hear more about Kegan's life story, pick up a copy of his memoir, Phoenix Revival. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Head Game. If you enjoyed it, please leave me a review. I'm at Middleton. See you in the next episode.